Welcome everyone to Prophet in the Court of the King, part of Grisha's Summer Offerings with Rabbi David Silber. In this class, we will look at how the relationship between king and court prophet can be fraught. This course will explore the tensions and complexities of this connection through study of the prophet in the books of Samuel and Kings. As mentioned, this class is part of our Summer Offerings, and we're glad to have both people joining just for the afternoon, or who were also in our morning kollel. Sources from today will be shared on screen from Sefaria, but you are always welcome to follow along in your own Tanakh. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Silber.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, so it's a big topic. We meet a couple of times, 3 times altogether, I believe. And the book of Shmuel, Sefer Shmuel, as it's known, the main topic of the book is kingship. Question of kingship, is it positive? Is it a negative? Is it necessary, not necessary, etc.? That is the core question of the book. Last week we saw that the way the book is structured, in the beginning, the governors of the country, the ones who seem to run the show, are the priests. The priests, our central temple is located in a place called Shiloh. The high priest is Eli. His sons run the show, Hophni and Pinchas. His sons are utterly corrupt, and they will be destroyed, as will Shiloh. Shiloh, as the governing center, that comes to an end in the 4th chapter of the 1st book of Samuel. Eli dies, his sons die. Shiloh is finished. The Ark of Shiloh is captured by the Philistines initially and then returned only later. And what happens in this vacuum is that suddenly there's a new leadership in the country, and that is the prophet. In particular, Samuel the prophet. Shmuel is the leader of the country. But in this book of Shmuel, which has either 55 or 57 chapters, depending if you count the first 2 chapters of Malachim as part of Shmuel, which may or may not be the case. In any event, of those 55 or 57 chapters in this book of Shmuel, he governs for slightly under 1 chapter. In chapter 7. In chapter 8, as we saw last week, he's already old. And the people go to Shmuel and say, "You are old. Your sons don't follow in your footsteps. The sons are corrupt. Choose for us a king like all the other nations." And Shmuel is upset about that. As we noticed last week, he's upset not so much as the other nations. That probably upsets God. But he's upset about the very request for a king. And he turns to God. And God says to him 3 different times in chapter 8, Shema b'kolam, listen to the people. God added, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. They haven't rejected you. Now again, have they rejected God because they want a king? Or have they rejected because they want a king like the other nations? That's a very important question. And as I mentioned last week, in the Torah itself, which talks about the institution of kingship in only one place, which is the 17th chapter of Sefer Devarim, I mentioned this last week, there it says, when you come into the land, and you ask for a king like all the other nations, that's what it says. And the Torah says you may place a king, you may or should place a king over yourself, som tosim alecha melech. Then the Torah adds one that God would choose, and one that is from the people. So one way to read the Chumash, which is my preferred way to read it, there are other ways to read it, is what the Torah is saying is, if you want to have a king, that's fine, but not like the other nations. You may request it like the other nations, which is what happens in the 8th chapter of Shmuel, but God says, or the Torah says, place upon yourself a king, but not like the other nations. One that God chooses or would choose, and one that is from the people. And in fact, this king is commanded to write a Torah and to read it, lest he become haughty. Levilti yorum levavav me'echav. He shall not depart from God's word, nor shall he become haughty. In other words, what the Chumash seems to be saying, and I mentioned this last week in chapter 17, is the king has two responsibilities. The king must understand that the leader has two responsibilities. One is to God. The king is subservient to God's will. That's number one. God is the boss. And number two, the king serves the people. The king should understand whom the king has to answer to. The king in theory has to answer to God, and the king in theory has to answer to the people. I mention this again, not only because of its singular significance, but for the following reason. In the book of Shmuel, it's called the book of Shmuel, what's curious is that Shmuel himself, is the greatest opponent of kingship. It's curious for two reasons. First of all, because his mother, Hannah, in the beginning of the book, prays for a king. God, give us a king who reflects your values. And number two, because Samuel himself is the kingmaker. He will anoint the two main characters of the book, King Saul and King David. And yet he is unalterably opposed to kingship. And why is he opposed to kingship? So in chapter 8 that we looked at last week, he's opposed to kingship because of the word yikach. He thinks the king will take and take and take. He'll take your children, he'll take your fields, he'll take your money, etc., etc., etc. The king will take and take and take. You may get fed up someday with all this. Will cry out to God, it will be too late. That's one objection that Samuel has to kingship. I would say that fits in very well with understanding your responsibility to the people. The king will forget his responsibility to the people. That's in chapter 8. In chapter 12, we're not studying the whole book of Shmuel here, so I'm just going to tell you where it is. In chapter 12, he has a different objection. This Saul has already been appointed king. And Samuel says, it was last week's Haftorah, actually. Last week's Haftorah, Korach. The Haftorah of Parshat Korach. So probably familiar to many of us. Samuel said, let us go to the Gilgal to renew the kingship. And Samuel makes a big speech in last week's Haftorah in chapter 12. Perhaps you recall what he said. He said, listen, here's the king. Here's King Saul, whom you chose. He stands before you. And then he talks about kingship. He says to the people, here's the king you requested. But you already have a king. God is your king. Hashem Elohechem Malkechem. But God is your king. And you have sinned grievously in requesting a king. You have rejected God. Because the real model, Samuel says, is to be found in the previous book of the Bible, the book of Shoftim. There the people in trouble cried out to God, and God sends a redeemer. Whether it's Gideon, whether it's Yiftach, whether it's Samuel, mentions himself in the same breath. And that's the right way. God is the king. God will respond to your prayers, etc. In the very requesting of a king, Lish'ol, in the very requesting, that's the sin. So in other words, in chapter 12, I would say it relates essentially to what the Torah says, one that God chooses, or God would choose. The king is answerable to God. The king must read God's Torah. And the king's not going to read God's Torah. And therefore, kingship itself is a heresy. And in chapter 8 that we saw last week, that's a different problem. It's going to rob you blind. The king will rip the people off. Those are Samuel's objections. This is Samuel the kingmaker. But what God said to Samuel 3 times in chapter 8 is 2 little words. Shema b'kolam. Listen to the people. You can warn them, but listen to the people. Fine. At the end of the day, Samuel the prophet must obey the people because God tells him to do so, and Samuel will follow what God instructs him to do. Or does he really? That's one of the questions in the book of Shmuel. The book of Shmuel read it without apologetics. Let's see what it actually says in the book. And does he actually do what the people want? What the people want is, and as I mentioned last week, they want Samuel to be involved in the choice. They like Samuel. He's just old, and his sons are no good. Now, as a side point, Samuel doesn't seem to understand that his sons are no good. In chapter 12, he says, he takes it as a personal rejection. What have I done wrong? He says to the people. You've done nothing wrong. And my sons are still with you, he says. My sons are with you. Yes, your sons are with us. It's part of the problem. But Shmuel doesn't see that. There's always the personal element over here. So he objects to it in theory. He really objects. It's not false. He believes that the request for kingship is sinful. He believes the king will rip people off. And the history of kings suggests that he's not completely off base over here. But he also added, and my sons are with you. The book
Rabbi Silber,
yes.
sorry to interrupt. I just want to know, I'm a little confused. I don't remember hearing about Shmuel's sons.
Well, you didn't, well, maybe I didn't emphasize it. Yes, his sons are found in chapter 8 as being corrupt, and they're mentioned in chapter 12.
Oh, okay, thank you.
They're mentioned explicitly. Well, it says explicitly in chapter 8. They didn't follow his path. Now, let's take a look and see what happens. Now, Shmuel is given a charge. Shmuel is to be involved in choosing the king of Israel. Okay? In chapter 7, he's the prophet who leads the people. And now in chapter 8, he's instructed by God to obey the people and to choose a king. Now let's take a look at chapter 9. Again, we can't cover this whole vast topic, but we will hit at some of the main points over here and some of the problems that we encounter. I'll read chapter 9. Vayhi ish b'Binyamin ushmo Kish ben Aviel ben Tzror ben Bechorat ben Afiach ben Ishimini Gibor Chayo. Lo haya ben ushmo Shaul b'chur v'tov. Ein ish b'bnei Yisrael tov mimenu. This is the introduction. There's a man from the tribe of Benjamin whose name is Kish. He gives his genealogy. He has a son. His son is good, is Tov, handsome, excellent young man. There's none of Israel Tov mimenu. None was better. Here they translate more handsome, but the word Tov carries with it a moral quality as well. He's head and shoulders above the others. Okay, we are now introduced to the future king of Israel, whose name is Shaul. By the way, I wanted to emphasize a different point here about kingship. And this is an important point. When you read the first couple of verses of chapter 9, the first thing you read is, there was a man from the tribe of Benjamin. The choosing of the king from the tribe of Benjamin is significant, is a very significant point. Why is the king chosen from the tribe of Benjamin? Benjamin is the youngest of Jacob's sons. Why would the king come from the tribe of Benjamin? And the important point here is, because the book that leads into Shmuel is the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges. The last story in the book of Shoftim is about a civil war. It's a civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and all the other tribes. It's a civil war in which the tribe of Benjamin is virtually annihilated, and it's going to die out. And the other tribes regret that, and they figure out a way that the tribe of Benjamin can be repopulated. They give the advice to the tribe of Benjamin to kidnap women from the other tribes, which takes place in the temple in Shiloh. But there are certainly negative feelings, without question, about the tribe of Benjamin. So the choosing of the king from the tribe of Benjamin, therefore, given the context, is a way of saying we have to unify the nation. The point of having a king, among other things, is that the king is a king of the entire nation. The king is not a king of one tribe. The king may come from a tribe. The king will come from one of the tribes. But the king has to go beyond the tribe. The king goes beyond the family and beyond the tribe. The king is the king of everybody, of the entire nation. So therefore, the choice of Benjamin, from this perspective, is a very interesting choice. What do we know about Shaul? We know he's big and tall, and we know he's called Tov, and there's no one who's more Tov than he is. And now we're told a little story. Once again, this we can't explore all of this issue. So I'm picking up on pieces of it. The issue to be explored properly requires a study of the book of Samuel, which is a very worthwhile study. It's one of the great books. It's one of the great books, period. So it's one of the great books in the Bible. Vatovadna atonot l'kish avi Shaul. Vayom Akish Shaul b'no. Kach no'itcha et achad mehanorim v'kum lecha v'kum lech bakeshet atonot. So his father says to Saul, listen, I lost some donkeys over here, right? Take one of the boys with you and find those atonot, find the donkeys. So now we're told that Saul has a mission, find my father's donkeys, bring them back. Vayavor b'har Ephraim, vayavor b'eretz shal isha v'lo matzo, vayavru b'eretz shalayim v'ayin, vayavor b'eretz yimini v'lo matzo. So they're traveling through different places, different parts of the country. District of Shalayim, they can't find them there. Can't find them in the territory of Benjamin. Hema bo b'eretz Tzuf. They come to the land of Tzuf. V'Shaul amar l'naro, asher imo, v'chavin ashuva, pen yechdal avi mina atonot v'da'ag lanu. So Saul, they come to the land of Tzuf. And Saul said to the young man with him, let's return, let's go back. My father will stop worrying about the donkeys and he'll start worrying about us. We're doing all this journey, we can't find them. I'm concerned about my father's feelings. Let's go back home. Fine. We continue reading, scroll down. Next verse. Vayomer lo, hinena ish Elohim ba'ir hazot. Va'ish nichbad, ko asher yedaber bo yavo. Aton nechasham, ulai yagid lanu et darkenu asher halachnu aleha. So the young man says to Saul, listen, in this city, I hear there's a man of God. Whatever he says comes true. Why don't we go there? Maybe he'll tell us about the journey, the errand for which we set out. So the young guy says, listen, we shouldn't go back at this point. There's a guy around here, a man of God, and whatever he says, he knows what he's talking about. Maybe he'll tell us about where these donkeys are. So Saul said to the young man, Saul says, listen, what do we have to give to the fellow? I have no bread left. Teshuvah, I have no present to give him. Now, he assumes that in order to get the answer from this holy man, you got to pay him some money. I have no money left. We have nothing left. Yosef anar lanot, but the young guy doesn't. He persists. The young guy says, "Hinei nimsa biyodi reva shekel kesef. V'natati l'isha Elohim v'yigid lanu et darkenu." Let's stop here for a moment. The young guy says, the servant says, "I have a quarter shekel. Got a few coins in my pocket. I'll give them to the man of God, Ish Elohim. He'll tell us about our errand." Let's stop here for a moment and consider this dialogue. And here the Hebrew is very important. They have come to the land of Tzuf. What is the word Tzuf mean? What is Tzuf?
Float.
Tzuf? No, it can be Tzafa up there, but it can mean to float. But what is what?
To see.
To see, yes, right. That's so fair. What is it so fair? That's so fair is a lookout, right? A scout or a lookout. They come to the land of vision. They're coming to the land of vision, Eretz Tzuf. And Saul says, time to go back. The young guy says, no, there's a holy man in the city. To which Saul responds, Uman navi la'ish. What can we give to the man? But of course, the text plays with the word Navi, which is a prophet. And not only that, there's another play. It says, I have no bread left in my thing, and I have no gift. What is the word for gift? Tishura. Tishura is a gift. What is the biblical word lashur? What is the word lashur in biblical Hebrew? It means to see. Lashur means to see. For example, in one of Bilam's prophecies, Er'enu v'lo ata, ashurenu v'lo karov. Right? In his vision about the distant future. I see, but not now. Tishurenu, I see. In other words, you have the land of Tzuf, you have Lashur, and you have Navi. And if that's not enough, we have the next verse, which is a very interesting verse, verse number 9. Lifanim b'Yisrael. Earlier, in those days, right? In those days, Kolmar ish b'lechto v'drosh Elohim. A person would say the following: when a person would seek out God, the person would say, "L'chu v'nelcha ad haroeh." Let us go to the seer, S-E-E-R, the one who sees. Ki lanavi hayom yikarei lefanim haroeh. Because nowadays, what we call a navi, in those days they would call a seer. Now, apart from the fact that obviously this is being written much later, it's not Samuel writing this, someone talking much later, looking back. In those days, they called the prophet the Roeh. But leaving out the time when this book is written, it's not our topic right now. But the point is, in case you missed the word Sofer and the play on Navi and the word Lashur, here you have the Navi is called the Roeh, the one who sees. Now, what is the point of the story over here? So let me put it to you this way. There are three, in a way. Who are the characters in the story? There's Saul. There's the Nar who goes with him, and they're searching for the lost animals, for the Atonot. And let me just to give you some sense of how the book works. Every time I get back to Shmuel, I haven't really urged to teach the whole book of Shmuel over again. I've taught it several times, but there's always a million new things. There's another story where you have a similar cast of characters. And that story familiar to everyone here. It's called the Binding of Isaac. In the Binding of Isaac, Abraham is given a charge, a mission to leave where you are and to take your son, your only son, Yitzchak, and to bring him up as a sacrifice. And Avram immediately hears the command, gets up early in the morning, chapter 22 of Breshit, Vayashkem Rav Baboker, and he sets out with Isaac, and he sets out with two Na'arim. He takes two lads with him, right? He has the Chamor, he travels with the donkey, the Chamor, right? And he's traveling with Yitzchak and the two Na'arim. And as he's traveling there, he sees the place from afar. Vayaret hamakom merachok. Abraham sees the place from a distance. At which point, he turns to the two young men with him, the two Na'arim. What does he say to the two Na'arim? He says, listen, I'm going up ahead. Shvu lechem poem hachamor. You stay with the Chamor. So me and the Nar, that's Yitzchak, will go there. You two Na'arim stay behind with the Chamor, right? Abraham has seen the place from a distance. So the two Na'arim presumably don't see anything. And they're staying back with the Chamor. Abraham goes there, as we know. And then he's going to see again the angel calling to him and saying, don't do it. And that's the story of the Akedah. That's a story. There's another story, though, that plays off the Akedah, and one that we're going to read very soon. It's a couple of weeks away. And that's the story of Bilam in chapter 22 of Sefer Bamidbar. There, the story of Bilam. Bilam is a prophet for hire. And the king of Moab hires Bilam to curse Israel. So initially God says, don't go. And fine. So Bilam tells the messengers, I can't go. But they come back with a better offer. They offer more money. Maybe I didn't honor you enough. So Bilam turns to God again. And God says, you want to go, you can go. But you're going to say whatever I tell you to say. So Bilam gets up early in the morning. This is found in chapter 22 of Bamidbar. We're going to read it in a couple of weeks. So he saddles his donkey, once again over here. They translate ass and not donkey. I don't know why they have different translations. Either way, God is angry that he went, even though God gave permission, but there's no reason to go because you can't accomplish anything. But he goes. Now we have the following. Chapter 22, verse 22. Vayityatzeiv malach Hashem baderech l'satanro. Hu rochev al atono. Ushnei na'arav imo. Bilam is traveling together. He's riding on the aton, and he has the two na'arim. Now, the two na'arim in the Bilam story don't function in any capacity whatsoever. We didn't even know he had na'arim with him, but they have a very important function because they recall the story of the Akedah. You have the same characters again. You have Bilam, you have the na'arim, and you have the aton. In this story, though, the Narim don't figure it all. We never hear anything about the Narim, but we do hear about the Aton, because we have the talking Aton over here. Bilam, not only the talking Aton, but the Aton actually sees the angel standing in the way with the sword to block the path of Bilam doesn't see the angel with the sword, but the Aton sees and the Aton speaks. So we have three stories. It's actually very interesting. There are three stories. When you read story number 3, which is our story of Saul with the Nar searching for the Aton. In our story, what is emphasized is that the Nar understands something that Saul doesn't understand. In the Bilam story, it's that the Aton, that God, the point of that story being, if God wants a message to get through, the message is going to get through. Whether it's a human being or whether it's a donkey or whatever, God's message will get through. In the case of the Abraham story, it's about Abraham and Isaac. They're the Hamar and the Narim are irrelevant. They can't see. Only Abraham sees perfectly. But in our story, it's the Nar. It's the Nar who sees. Now, the point is, what is the point of all of this for our purposes? And here is the point. We know one thing about King Saul. We know he's a good man. He's not a king yet. He's a good person. He's worried about his father's feelings. Maybe we should go back. My father will worry about us. But the Nar, not Saul, the Nar says, we can't go back now because there's somebody who can actually help us. There's somebody who sees. They're in the land of Tzuf. There's a Navi, who in those days was called the Ro'eh. And the word Teshuvah factors in. In other words, it sounds like Saul is someone who is unaware of prophecy altogether. Seems to be completely unaware of prophecy, and that's emphasized by the fact the Nar with him understands. He knows from nothing. Now, they're going to proceed. They're already there. So he says, listen, what do we have to lose? Let's inquire. What do we have to lose? So what happens? So Saul says, okay, I got no money to pay the guy. You got to pay him. Don't worry, I got a few coins in my pocket. Fine. So they're going to proceed to ask to inquire this holy man, this Ish Elohim. We don't yet know who the holy man is, but we suspect that we might know who it is. And now we have the following. They keep walking, and Saul says in verse 16 now, okay, verse 13, I'm sorry, verse 13, Tov, we'll do what you say. We'll go to the city with the holy man. Hema Olim b'Malel Ayir, and they're traveling, climbing the ascent to the city. Hema Matzu Na'arot Yotzot Lishov Mayim, and they meet some young girls drawing water. Vayamru lahem, and they say to them, Ayesh Bazeh HaRo'eh, is there a seer over here? Vatanena otam vatomarna yesh, hidei lefanecha. Maher ata, ki hayom bo la'ir. Ki zevach hayom la'am b'bama, k'v'achem ha'ir, came to seno oto, b'terem yaleh b'mato lecho, ki lo yochal ha'am ad bo'o, hu yivarech ha'zevach, achrei chen yochu ha'kruim, v'yato alu, ki oto k'hayom timse'un oto. They make these young girls at the well drawing the water. Is there a seer in this place? And these young women know the whole story. He comes on this day. This is what he does. You better hurry up. He blesses the sacrifice, etc., etc., etc. So the Naarot know all about it. The Nar knows something about the holy man in the city. The guy who seems blissfully unaware is this Saul, this very good man Saul. Fine. Fine. Now we're told in verse 15, Vashem galad ozen Shmuel yom echad lifnei Moshe u'leimar. God had spoken to Samuel a day earlier. Samuel, Shmuel, you'll say it's Samuel, the holy man. And God had spoken to Samuel a day earlier, saying, Ka'id machar eshlach elecha ish me'eretz binyamin. I'm going to send to you a man from the tribe of Benjamin. U'mishachto l'nogid al ami Yisrael. Appoint him as the leader of my people Israel. V'oshia et ami b'yad Plishtim. He will save Israel from the Philistines. Ki ra'iti et ami. I have seen my people. Ki bar tzakato elai. I have seen my people. What God is saying to Samuel is, listen, you may be called the ro'eh. You're the seer. I also see. I see the suffering of my people, and someone's going to save them. Someone that I've chosen. Notice the emphasis from the tribe of Benjamin. And your job is to anoint him as king. That's your job. Fine. Now let's see what happens. Ushmuel ra'ah et Shaul. Samuel saw Saul. He's the seer. Vashem anahu. Hinei ish asher amarti elecha. Ze yatzar bi'ami. This is the man that I told you shall govern my people. Vayigash Shaul et Shmuel b'toch hashar. Saul meets Samuel in the gate. Vayomer, Hagidon Ali, Eza Beit Torah. He says, excuse me, mister, do you know where the ro'eh is to be found? Where does the ro'eh stay? Vayan Shmuel el Shaul, Vayomer, Anochi haro'eh. I am the seer. Alei lefanai habama, v'achaltem imi hayom, v'shilachticha baboker, v'chol asher b'uvavcha agidlach, v'ratonot u'movdot lach hayom shloshet yamim, al tasim el libcha lahem, ki nimtzo, u'lemi kol chemdat Yisrael, alo lecha u'lechol beit avicha. So we have a speech of Shmuel to Saul. Shmuel has one task here. Shmuel's task is to anoint Saul as king. That's all God said to him. Anoint him as king. But as we will see, he doesn't simply anoint him as king. There's going to be a whole procedure over here. Before we get to the whole procedure, I want to ask you a question. Namely, what is the meaning of verse number 20? He says to them, listen, you're going to come with me. I'll tell you whatever you want to know. Concerning those donkeys, they were found already. Forget about them. And the end of verse number 20. Ulemi kol chemdat Yisrael, alo lecha ulecha beit avicha. What is the meaning of Ulemi kol chemdat Yisrael? What is the meaning of chemdat Yisrael? There are two different possible translations of this verse, and they mean two very different things. So the translation I have before me, JPS, is, for whom is all of Israel yearning, if not for you and all your ancestral house? Chemdat Yisrael refers to desire. He says, listen, forget about the donkeys, they're found. And let me tell you something, all of Israel is yearning for you. That's one way to read Chemdat Yisrael. Now, there's another way to read Chemdat Yisrael, which is not that Israel is yearning for you, but the choice things of Israel. And then that reads very differently. He's saying to him, listen, the donkeys, you worried about some donkeys? They were found a long time ago. Listen, mister, don't worry about donkeys. The valuables of Israel will all be yours. That's a different conception. What are you worried about donkeys for? You're going to become the king. You'll be able to rip off whatever you want. As he said earlier, you'll take. You're worried about a few donkeys. Desirable things of Israel will be yours. And that's very different. That would express a different view, which is perhaps what he really thinks. We know he's against the kingship for the reason he gave in chapter 8, the governing word of Yikach, the king will take. In any event, I have one basic point I want to make about for our purposes, the story over here. And that is, 2 points. First of all, that Shmuel, all we know is he's told to anoint him as king. And yet, we have the remainder of chapter 9, we have chapter 10, where there's a whole procedure over here about appointing him as king. And then we have chapter 12 on top of it, a continued story about the appointing of Shaul by Shmuel. And the question is, what does it say about Shmuel? That's point number 1. And point number 2 that I began with is, we have a person here who seems, when it comes to prophecy, seems to know very, very little about prophecy. The young people seem to know a lot more than he does. The girls of the run know all about it. And even the young man traveling with him knows about the Ish Elohim in the city. So what does that say to us? And I want to make one main point now about the king and the prophet. Well, let's just read a little bit more first, then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. Fine. As we read through the chapter, so Samuel invites Saul to join him. What we have over here is a sacrificial meal. I'm not going to read through all the verses in 22 and 23 and 24. And Shmuel says to Shaul, you can eat part of the sacrificial meal, even though it's by invitation only. It's a meal by invitation only, but your place has already been set up because God told him a day in advance. I knew you were coming. I set aside a place for you. It's fine. So, right. And then we have a very strange thing. After it says that I've reserved the food for you. And then we have verse number 24. Verse 25. This all is taking place on the bama, the high place. It's where the sacrifice is brought. They go, leave the bama and go to the city. Vayedaber im Shaul al Hagag, and he speaks to Saul on the roof. It never tells us what he says to Saul on the roof. Vayashkibu, they get up early in the morning, and they're walking out of the city. Right? Kuma, he says, let me send you away. And as they're walking out of the city, Shmuel says to Shaul in verse 27, tell this young boy to go ahead. I want to be alone. Let me tell you what God has to say to you. And in chapter 10, Samuel takes the flask of oil, pours it on the head of Saul and kisses him and says, God has appointed you, Mishachacha Hashem anachlato v'nagid. God has appointed you as a nagid, as a leader. It's interesting, by the way, that in the story, when God speaks to Samuel and Samuel speaks to Saul, he avoids the word melech. Says, say Yatzar Bi'ami, twice the word Nagid. Like the word melech is a dirty word. You can't say the word melech, you know? And even God is sensitive. Okay, but he's being appointed. Samuel is anointing him as king. And now we have the following. It says, listen, when you leave me, you're going to leave me. V'lechtecha hayom me'imadi. U'motzat shnei anashim im kivrat Rachel b'gvul Binyamin b'tzeltzach. ויאמרו אליך נמצאו האתונות אשר הלכת לבקש. והנה נטש אביך את דברי האתונות ודאג לכם לאמור מה אעשה לי. The first thing that's going to happen when you leave is you're going to meet some people at Rachel's grave. And they're going to tell you the donkeys were found and your father's worrying about you. That's the first thing that's going to happen. Then you will keep walking. In verse number 3, you leave there and you come to another place. This is found in verse number 6 and verse number 7. And you'll find people that are carrying loaves of bread, carrying a jar of wine. They'll greet you and they'll offer you bread and wine and you'll accept it. And afterwards, you come to the garrison of the Philistines, and you will find in verse number 9, Chevel Nevi'im, a band of prophets, and they have musical instruments, and they are prophesying, and the Spirit of God will descend upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will become a different person. Now the question is, what is this all about? Because when you read the story, God had one very simple thing to say to Samuel. I've sent you a guy from the tribe of Benjamin. I want you to anoint him as king. But Shmuel doesn't simply anoint him as king. First, he invites him to the sacrificial meal. Then he talks to him on the roof. I can't get into that now because it never says what he told him on the roof. Then when he anoints him, he gives him signs, 3 signs. And the third of which is, you will meet a band of prophets and you will prophesy with them. And here's what I wanted to suggest about what's really taking place over here. What strikes me that what Shmuel is trying to do over here is to either turn Saul into a quasi-prophet or to have him experience prophecy so we will understand what it means to be a prophet. But the person he has chosen to experience prophecy is the most unlikely candidate for prophecy in the entire country. He knows nothing about prophecy. His nar knows much more than he does, and so do the young girls at the well. And therefore, when this does happen, the signs take place. But in verse number 11 of chapter 10, it says, "Vayihi kol yodo me'etmol shom vayiru v'nei im nevi'im niba vayomer am isha re'ehu ma ze hayol ben Kish agam Shaul ben V'yim." When they saw him, they said, "What? What happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul a prophet?" Vayan ish misham vayomer umi avihem. But someone said, 1 second, who is the father of any prophet? In other words, could be. It's unlikely, but it's possible, right? Okay, and therefore it became a saying, Agam Shaul ban V'yim. Now, what's interesting about this story over here is Saul a prophet, is that it actually gets repeated later in the book. Because later in the book, Saul desires to get rid of David. He sees David as a successor, as usurper of the throne. And David later runs away to Shmuel. It's the one interaction David has with Shmuel, apart from being anointed by Samuel. And in that story, Saul chases after David. And as he's about to come to David, Samuel causes the spirit of prophecy to fall upon Saul, who takes off all his clothing, and he becomes a kind of prophet, sort of King Lear story. And there it says, and therefore they said, is Saul a prophet? The point of the 2 stories is, whereas over here, is Saul a prophet? So strange. Someone says, could be. It's not impossible. Because to be a prophet, it doesn't mean you come from prophets. Your father's not a prophet, but you're a prophet. But later on, it becomes clear that Saul and prophecy are mutually exclusive. What marks the king are the kingly garments. The prophet takes off his garments. Now, here's the point. What is this actually about? Why must Saul be a prophet to be king? What is that about? So what I would maintain is he doesn't have to be a prophet to be king, and on the contrary, he probably even shouldn't be a prophet. And here's the main point I want to make, and this is actually a very important point towards an understanding of this book, which is the following. The book begins with the priesthood running the country. And they're gone. By chapter 4, they're finished. Then for 1 chapter, the prophet runs the country. That's Samuel, chapter 7. The people request a king in chapter 8. And in the book of Samuel, there are 2 kinds of kings. And the first is King Saul. But King Saul, actually, when you read the stories of Saul, is not a fully independent king. Because Samuel, who's against kingship in the first place, has determined to turn this guy into a prophet. But of course, he can't be a prophet. He knows nothing of prophecy. But the idea of turning to a prophet is, among other things, if he's a prophet, We know from the book, it says explicitly later on that the prophets are under the guidance of Samuel. Samuel is the head of the prophets. The prophets are Samuel's prophets. So the attempt over here is to take Saul, who could be an independent king, and turn him into a subsidiary of one of the subjects of the prophet. I want to make this point. This is actually a very important point about the book, that David and Saul are very different, of course, in many ways. But the key difference from the standpoint of the book is this. Saul's kingship is never fully independent of the prophet. In other words, the way Samuel sets it up, at least, Saul and Samuel are kind of partners. It's a partnership that doesn't work. See, in principle, if you ask, what is the ideal kingship? What is the ideal model of leadership? I would say the ideal model of leadership is actually Saul and Samuel, because it's what could be better. Because the prophet tells you what God wants, and the king carries it out. It reminds me sort of Megillah Esther, Mordechai understands what has to happen, but he has no idea how to do it. His idea is very stupid, because how could he know? Go and beg the king for help. And Esther knows that's ridiculous. King couldn't care less. I mean, beg him for help. Plead with the king. Speak ethnic. What? That's not going to work. Esther understands. You got to convince the king that the real enemy is somebody else. And then maybe. She understands how to do it, but she has to be convinced to do it. And Mordechai understands what has to get done. So it's a perfect partnership. Each one has their role. The problem with Saul and Samuel is, even though it's ideal, but it doesn't work because in order for it to work, each one has to respect the other one's role. And Samuel doesn't respect the role of Saul. Samuel doesn't want Saul to be an independent governor. Samuel wants Saul to be under his guidance. And the moment in the book, if you remember, that Saul disobeys, does he really disobey? Samuel said, go and wait for me for 7 days. And he waits for 7 days. And Samuel doesn't show up. So Saul brings the sacrifice. Wait for me the 7 days to bring the sacrifice, he says. And Saul waited for 7, not clear, he waited. He brought the first two, and then Shmuel shows up. Did he delay intentionally? And then Saul says, what did you do? Saul says, I couldn't wait anymore. He says, you're a fool, he says. Your kingship might have succeeded. Now you will fail. And he leaves him. And the point is, whether it's intentional or not, in other words, what's interesting is that the one who's supposed to bring the sacrifice is actually the prophet. In other words, but the point is, when you have a reversal of roles, with David is something different. The prophet doesn't tell David what to do. You don't have a single situation where the prophet instructs David what to do. The prophet is present in David's court, and we'll see this next week, to correct the mistakes. The prophet is a moral voice after the fact to either tell David he did the right thing, or more importantly, to David he did the wrong thing. But David is the autonomous king. We're moving in this book from prophet to shared leadership, which doesn't work, to the autonomous king. But the ideal kingship actually, in theory, is the partnership of Samuel and Saul, but it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, in my view, in my reading, is primarily the fault lies with Shmuel, because he doesn't give space to Saul to be what Saul is, which is a great warrior. Saul is a great warrior. And what happens is that because he imposes upon him this prophecy, which is completely inappropriate, that doesn't work. And I would add something else, and that is that I believe that actually the later on, after Saul is told he can't be king anymore, if you remember later in chapter 17, a ruach ra'ah depends upon Saul. An evil spirit devolves upon him. And it strikes me as something to think about, that the ruach ra'ah, right, is in a certain way related to the prophecy that's foisted upon him earlier. In other words, this person is not somebody who is fit for prophecy, which is not a critique of him at all. He's not a prophet. He's a great warrior. He's a courageous leader. He's the one who actually unifies the nation. Saul is the unifier of the nation. And what happens is when you take somebody who's fit to do one task and you impose upon him a different task, Because you believe, and I'm saying in defense of Shmuel, he really believes that the true leadership should be a prophet. The people have rejected that. We don't want a prophet to lead us. We want a politician to lead us. Shmuel's against that. So yes, God says Shema b'kolam, but it's very hard to just obey God and do it and Shema b'kolam when you in your gut feel it's not right. And furthermore, we can't avoid the fact that, and he says it explicitly, that he still feels his son should follow, should be the leaders of the people, despite the fact that quite obviously they are totally inappropriate. Let me just stop at this point, and take any comments or questions that one may have about this particular story and about this model of leadership that we have. There was the prophet in the court of the king. When it comes to Shmuel, it's more than just in the court of the king. It's the prophet who actually tries to control the king. And sad to say is, that's not going to work. It's not going to work for the king. Let me just say one more point about what happens when you try to control another person, which is not about kingship. It's more about life in general. What happens is Saul, famously in chapter 15, story of Amalek, he doesn't carry out the command as he should, and the kingship will be torn away from him. End of chapter 15, Shmuel is told by God, Saul failed to obey me. Saul did not carry out my command about Amalek. I'm going to tear the kingship away from him. I regret I made him king. Shmuel goes out to greet Saul at the end of chapter 15. And I want to say two things. First of all, when Shmuel is told by God that Saul is out, he cries out to God all night, it says, Vayizako Hashem. He's very upset about that. Then later he confronts Saul. At the end of that story, he says to Saul, you're out. You're not going to be the king anymore. He turns to walk away, and it says, and his coat is torn. And Samuel said, God has torn the kingship away from you and given it to a better person. And God will not change God's mind. God is not a human being who changes his mind. When you read the story of the torn coat and the prophecy of Samuel, the question that is obvious is, whose coat is torn? Because the story says that Samuel's walking away from Saul and he grabs his coat by chazek, he holds on to the coat and he tears it. So who tears which coat? It sounds, when you read the story, that the coats, that sounds like maybe Saul is grabbing for Samuel, he's walking away and he tears the coat. Or maybe Samuel tears his own coat. But it doesn't sound like the coat that's being torn is the coat of Saul. It sounds like it's the coat of Samuel. Why would the coat of Samuel be the symbol of the loss of kingship of Saul? But given the explanation, it's clear. Because once Saul is gone, Samuel's gone. Samuel's leadership is a function of Saul, who was chosen to be, they're supposed to work together in some sense. But the next king of Israel is an autonomous king. And that actually in the next chapter, in chapter 16, God says to Shmuel, go to the house of Jesse, to Yishai. I've seen a person there. And Samuel says, I can't go. I'm afraid to go. Saul will kill me. That's okay. Go and bring a sacrifice. And Samuel walks into the house. And the first person he sees in chapter 16 is Eliyav, the oldest son of Yishai, who's big and tall. And Samuel says, the anointed of God stands before him. And God says to Samuel, no, not the way you humans see. You can always see the externals. God can see into the heart. Now, here's the point I want to make about that story. Shmuel is called Shmuel HaRo'eh, Samuel the seer. But the seer doesn't see. God says to Samuel the seer, you can't see anything. You're just a human being. You see nothing. Only I can see. That's how the story begins. I have seen someone in the house of Yishai. What precludes somebody from seeing? Why can't people see? And the answer is when you try to control the other person, when you try to grab power, it's one of the basic themes of this book. You fail to see. You can no longer see. What he sees is another Saul, big and tall guy. Another guy I can control. Says God, no. That model's gone. You can't see anything, mister. You see nothing. Only I can see. I've someone that I want, someone that I see. So the point is, it's not just the demise of Saul, the king. But my point is, it's also the demise of Samuel the prophet. And so it's a model which I believe in principle is the best model, actually. Perfect model. But shared leadership is very difficult. In this book, it's an impossibility. And therefore, the book moves to a different kind of leadership, which is the autonomous king, who also has a prophet in his court. And next week, we'll take a look at that. The prophet is the prophet Natan, David's friend and David's prophet, who will figure in 3 different stories. Now, again, the book of Shmuel requires, a lot of work, obviously. I'm just pointing out certain things. But I think that the trajectory is clear, from prophet to prophet and king to king alone. Okay, let me stop at this point and take any comments or questions you may have.
David,
Yes,
hi, Ruthie Shane here.
yeah,
So what you're saying is what the first line of the book says, that's the theme here, that's Sophim. It's all about seers or people who think they can, or people don't know they can. It's all Sophim.
that's right. The book begins with Sophim, the very first verses of the book. And the point of that story of Hannah is, Hannah sees perfectly, actually. She's the only one who actually sees what's going on around. And the reason she sees is because she's utterly powerless. She's a woman, no children. The husband says, forget your dreams, surrounded by nice people, but who have no understanding of her whatsoever. And she can see perfectly. And that's part of the challenge of the book. The challenge of the book is what allows us to see. It's true in life in general. I think it's especially true when it comes to prayer, actually. What allows us to see the truth, allows us to free ourselves from those things that prevent us from seeing, which are basically being vested in something else, being attached in something else. I can't do this because if I do this, what will my boss say? What will my family say? What will my Rabbi say? What will my imagined Rabbi say? My community, etc. We have a million reasons. How do you free yourself from that to be able to see what's obvious? It's obvious to Hannah. Shiloh was utterly corrupt. We did new leadership. It's obvious to us. It's clear. But it's clear to nobody else. No one else sees it because they don't want to see it if they can't see it. And that is the theme of the book. It's true it's true in general, and it's true of Samuel. The seer who can't see. That's one of the themes of the book. The Roeh who's not Roeh.
Rabbi Silber, since we learned in Mishpatim all about the subject of Shochad, it's not that it's Shochad, but Shmuel is much too invested in Shaul. So it's the same idea. He cannot think objectively anymore. It's not Shochad, but he's afraid, which is sad,
That's right. It's a very good point. That is exactly the point, that Shochad comes in many forms. It's a sometimes desire to control, and sometimes it's connections and real connections that we have, which preclude us from seeing what is obviously the case. And the question is, how does one free oneself from that? I think that's how do we get to the authentic person? That's the challenge of prayer, actually. How do you get through all the layers to get to the authentic person? How do you find this authentic person? It's a very good question. And there are certain ideas about how one can possibly get there. I think somehow music sometimes is a way to get to the real self, or is helpful in any event. But this is the challenge. But as we've said before, about the book begins with Sophim, and that's the danger. The danger is not seeing. It's not just corruption. The danger is you actually can't see. We'll get to this next week when it comes to David, but that's the challenge. And that's Samuel's own objection to kingship, basically. I mean, his objections are real objections. And the book is called the Book of Samuel. Yes, God says nonetheless. But his objections about what a king might be, might become, etc., those are real.
Rabbi?
Okay. Yes.
Rabbi,
Yes.
quick question about Hannah.
Yes.
If you're saying that Hannah sees very clearly, she tries the world's most chutzpahdik power play ever. She threatens God. She says she's going to try and do the soda ritual just so that
That's
she
not
can
in the
get.
text. That's a medrash. It doesn't say that in the text. That is true. You're 100% right about the Gemara says that, and that's a different point. That is true. That I mentioned this last week about prayer, and you have it with Hannah too. you have it in a different sense in the Pshat with Chana, because on one hand, Chana says, I am your servant, I am your servant, I am your servant. The other hand, she's saying is, listen, give me the opportunity to make it right, and I'll do a better job than you do. The point is, prayer has these two aspects to it, which are contradictory. On one hand, prayer involves self-negation. Prayer is a recognition that, what do I know? Who am I anyway? On the other hand, the very fact that we are requesting from God, in the case of some people, maybe even demanding, had these two things come together. And you've hit on a very important point about prayer. It's a certain, for one standpoint, it's chutzpah. Yeah, with Abraham, God, you're the judge of the whole earth. How can you kill the innocent together with the guilty? Then he says, I know I'm just dust and ashes. Who am I to even talk this way? How about 40? How about 30? How about 20? So he's negotiating. At the same time, every so often he stops. He says, this is crazy. Who am I to say these things? But he continues. And therein lies the paradox of prayer. So as you say, and the Gemara says, she even threatens, I'll be a sota. And then you'll have no choice. But it's the same tension, I say, between a recognition of our lower status, of a mortal staying before the infinite. On the other hand, we are human beings who have needs, and our tradition says we're entitled to ask God, and sometimes even to question or even to challenge. But you hit upon something that's very, very central in prayer, the paradox of prayer, I would call it. All right, I have to stop, I guess, at this point. Okay, so we'll continue next week with David's kingship and the prophet in David's court. It's not a partnership. David is autonomous, but David does have a prophet, and that's Nathan. We'll get to that. Nathan figures in 3 stories, most famously David and Bathsheba, but he figures in 2 other stories as well. So next week we will continue with that.
Rabbi,
Yes.
do you have time for a question? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
It's the idea of freeing yourself from worrying about what will my family think, what will my community think, or all that type of thing.
Yes.
I agree very much that can help you find who you really are. But where I have difficulty is then you have to get back into the real world and
That's right.
reconcile. How will you deal with what you know are going to be the objections of your family, the objections of your community, that, they're not always so easy to overcome. It certainly can help you feel like you've come to terms with, you've accepted who you are, you've come to terms with that, but you're still going to have to deal with those outside adversities.
No, I'm not suggesting it's easy. I'm saying you get to a certain truth. Then the question is,
Correct.
How do you live in your world with this truth? I would say something else, which is I do have a meeting in 2 minutes, but let me just say one more thing about this, about prayer in general. And that is that my understanding of prayer is that let's take, for example, Musaf, the Musaf service. We talk about restoring the sacrifices. And the point is, many people, myself included, that's not the first thing on my agenda, to restore the sacrifices. But the point is, in prayer, I believe, is to enter into this other world. In other words, when you enter into a mythic world, whether it's davening Musaf, whether it's the Avodah on Yom Kippur, you really are in the temple on Yom Kippur with the Avodah. And you have to enter into that, the kind of different kind of thinking. And then, once you leave that world, then you return to your world. And the question is, how does that mythic world affect how we live in the world in which we do function? But I think the idea of entering into a kind of imagined world, the power of imagination, and then returning to where we are, and how do you deal with the tension? Because the two are very different. That is a very important question. But the first step is to be able to, when it comes to prayer, to get to a truth about what is really the right thing to do. Who am I really? What am I really about? Easy said than done, believe me. But the point is, how do you get to that state? And I don't think it's usually just with the words of prayer. I think that's where the music can come in, and the visualization. There's all kinds of ideas around this, about how you can discover the real person. And then, as you say, then you return to the world in which we do live in, and then you got to figure it out. How does this truth play out in my life, given the reality of the world in which we live?
Exactly.
Alma de Shikra, it's the world of falsehood. how do we live with the truth in the world of falsehood? That's a very good question.
Right.
But I have to
Right.
stop at this point. I do have another meeting now.
Thank you, Rabbi.
But to be continued. You can always email me at dsilber.org if anybody has any questions or anything. There's a lot of issues around all this, obviously, and okay, so we'll
So
hopefully see you
Darabah,
next week.
thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you all and see you all
Okay.
next week.
Okay.